So the Continental Army was often in want of supplies.
Yes.
Washington knew these hardships well, and in a letter to John Bannister on April 21st, 1778, from Valley Forge, he wrote, For without arrogance or the smallest deviation from truth, it may be said that no history now extant can furnish an instance of an army's suffering which such uncommon hardships as ours have done, and bearing with them the same patience and fortitude, to see men without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lay on, without shoes by which their marches might be traced in the blood from their feet, and also as often without provisions as with marching through frost and snow, and at Christmas taking up their winter quarters within a day's march of the enemy, without a house or hut to cover them till they could be built, and submitting to it without a murmur is a mark of patience and obedience, which in my opinion can scarce be paralleled. So why was the Continental Army often without supplies?
There are a variety of reasons. One, of course, simply being that the supply system, logistics, as we refer to it, was fairly rudimentary. And so the simple act of gathering and delivering supplies was a significant challenge to men, to officers who had little or no experience in this. It was also true that the Continental Congress had very little money, and so even when supplies were available, farmers might be reluctant to sell them for IOUs or other kinds of instruments that would be given to the farmers for the goods. One of the sad commentaries, I think, about the suffering of the Army, and the very real suffering of the Army, is that America during the Revolution was not short of food and supplies. What was wrong here, what was the problem, was that those food and supplies did not get to the Army. And that, of course, would certainly angered people like Washington and others when they saw that food supplies, cattle, grain, etc., was available, but they couldn't get it to the soldiers because the farmers, the suppliers, were reluctant to sell it to the Congress. And so that was the problem. Not that the nation was in starvation. The nation was not in starvation, but the Army was. And it was a neglect of the Army and a rather disgraceful treatment of the Army that allowed the Army to suffer amidst, if not plenty, certainly amidst a nation that could well have supplied, was able to supply the men with what they need, but did not.
How did Washington respond, or how did he manage the lack of supplies, and how did he help try to secure supplies for the men?
Well, he would often send out foraging parties. That is, he would assign the task to a company, or perhaps even a larger number of men, and their task would be to go out and forage, that is, to gather up supplies. And they were expected to come back with supplies. So when they went out, they would take, many times taking them by force. Now sometimes, of course, you could justify it because you might be taking by force supplies from a Tory. That was okay. You could take anything you wanted from a Tory. But then there were others who perhaps were not Tories, and here you take their supplies, and the officer in charge of the foraging party would leave behind a promissory note or an IOU that the Congress owes you so much money. Well, good luck in getting that money. And so, again, the farmers were not eager, they were not anxious to see their chickens or cows or grain, whatever it might be, taken off by the Continental Army. The British, by the way, would do the same thing, although the British often had money. So the British might leave some gold behind, so that kind of softened it. But the Americans didn't have that grace. And so but you needed to feed the Army. These men needed to be fed. They had to be fed. And so indeed, by force of arms, Washington and his other officers would take supplies from neighboring farms and settlers.
So there was a general expectation among farmers that Congress was not going to pay up.
Oh yes, there was a general expectation, and a reasonable one, I might add, that the Congress was not going to pay up. Sometimes the Congress would get money and they might pay. Washington might on occasion be happy enough to have some money, but more often than he didn't. So it would have to depend upon the full faith and credit of the Congress.
How bad was it? Would you describe the conditions in that they were often starving, or that they were hungry, or?
I think that the conditions were hungry. I don't know about starving. I think that sometimes in the distance of time, we're more than 200 years away, and we read many of the records, there may have been some level of exaggeration. Do keep in mind that when people were writing to the Congress, they were writing for their plea and an appeal. So it was not in their interest to underestimate the situation. But having said that, there's no doubt whatsoever that the Army did suffer greatly from hunger, greatly from the lack of uniforms. All of that is quite true. But I think one needs to apply a certain caution when reading some of these accounts, given the circumstances under which they were written.